Breana Rouhselang was just 17, a cheerleader with a bright smile and dreams of the future, while Ethan, her older boyfriend, was drowning in fear of responsibility he didn't want. What began as a secret between two teenagers spiraled into betrayal, violence, and tragedy, because Breana's pregnancy became the reason her life was taken. Breana Rouhselang grew up in a small Indiana town where everyone seemed to know one another. The place had the comfort of quiet neighborhoods, local diners that stayed busy on weekends, and a high school that was the heart of the community. For most people, life followed a predictable rhythm. For Breana, that rhythm included sports, school, and cheerleading. She had an energy about her that others couldn't help but notice. Coaches admired her dedication, classmates liked her easygoing nature, and neighbors often remarked on her bright smile. She seemed to embody the promise of youth, someone standing at the edge of adulthood with the world open in front of her. But behind that cheerful image was a teenager carrying a secret she wasn't ready to share. At 17, she discovered she was pregnant. For anyone, that kind of news would be life-altering, but for someone still in high school, it was overwhelming. Breana wrestled with the reality in silence, unsure of who to turn to or how to explain what was happening. She knew her parents expected her to finish school, graduate, and follow a stable path. She also knew that in a small town, secrets never stayed hidden for long. The weight of what she carried pressed down on her, even as she tried to act normal in front of everyone else. At school, Breana's teachers noticed she seemed distracted. Homework that had once been turned in on time now came late, and her focus during practice slipped. Friends who spent time with her saw her mood change. She laughed less often, and sometimes drifted away in thought, staring at nothing in particular. They assumed she was just dealing with the usual teenage struggles, the pressure of growing up and making choices about the future. No one suspected the truth, and Breana worked hard to keep it that way. The father of her child was someone she thought she could trust. She had been in a relationship with him for a while, and though they were young, she believed they cared about each other. But as the days passed and her pregnancy became more real, she felt a growing distance from him. Where she longed for reassurance and stability, she instead felt unease. His responses were short, his expressions colder than before. She tried to convince herself it was only temporary, that he just needed time to process what was happening, but a quiet fear crept into her mind that maybe he was slipping away. Despite all of this, Breana continued to push forward. She kept going to school, kept cheering at games, and kept putting on the smile that others expected to see. She wanted to believe things would somehow work out, that life would smooth itself over, and that the fear twisting inside her would fade. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she lay awake, replaying everything in her head. What if her parents found out? What if her friends judged her? What if he left her completely alone? Each day, the secret grew harder to hide. In a town where everyone paid attention to each other's lives, it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the signs. Breana knew the truth would eventually come out, but she never imagined just how dangerous the consequences could become. She had no way of knowing that her biggest struggle would not be the pregnancy itself, but the storm of fear and desperation building in someone she thought she could depend on. The pregnancy was no longer just a private worry for Breana. It had become a shadow hanging over her relationship. Ethan, the young man who was supposed to be her partner, began to crumble under the pressure. He was barely managing his own responsibilities, and now the thought of fatherhood pressed against his mind like a weight he couldn't escape. To him, being tied down at such a young age was not a blessing, but a trap, one that threatened his freedom, his reputation, and his future. Instead of finding courage, he gave in to fear. That fear slowly hardened into resentment, and resentment soon began to poison his every thought. At first, his change in behavior was subtle. He grew quieter, less affectionate, and easily irritated. Where once there had been playful conversations and moments of teenage affection, there was now silence and avoidance. Breana noticed, of course, but she clung to hope. She told herself he was simply overwhelmed, that if she stayed patient, he would eventually come around. She wanted to believe the bond they shared could withstand this challenge, but Ethan's mind was already moving in a different, darker direction. In the privacy of his own thoughts, Ethan began to see the pregnancy not as a responsibility, but as a problem to be solved. Every time he imagined his parents finding out, or his friends whispering about him, his panic deepened. He couldn't picture himself raising a child, working to provide, or sacrificing the life he thought he was meant to live. Instead of facing the situation with maturity, he convinced himself that Breana's pregnancy threatened everything he valued. Each day, that distorted view grew stronger, until he began to believe there was only one way out. Breana, meanwhile, tried to manage her reality in silence. She carried her secret with a mixture of fear and determination, telling herself she could figure things out once Ethan steadied himself. She wanted to trust him, to imagine a future where they stood together, no matter how difficult it might be. But his distance was impossible to ignore. He stopped answering her texts right away, avoided meeting in public, and kept his voice low when they spoke. It was as if he wanted to erase every trace of their connection. The secrecy surrounding their situation began to close in. Breana's friends asked why she seemed more withdrawn. Her parents wondered why she looked tired, and her teachers noticed her slipping focus. The truth lingered just beneath the surface, threatening to break free at any moment. For Ethan, the pressure of that possibility was unbearable. He started to panic, not only about the baby, but also about what people would think of him if they learned he was the father. In his mind, exposure would mean shame, disappointment, and a future he hadn't chosen. Instead of accepting what was happening, he started to plan. The thoughts that crossed his mind were not fleeting. They stayed, grew, and festered. He imagined what life would be like if Breana wasn't pregnant. He thought about how different things could be if the problem simply vanished. The more he considered it, the more he convinced himself that he could take control. What should have been a time for him to show support turned into a time when he let fear twist into something sinister. Breana had no idea of the storm gathering on the other side of her relationship. She was focused on the small steps: finishing school, keeping her secret for just a little longer, and trying to believe in the boy she thought she knew. She had no reason to suspect that his silence was not just distance but calculation. She couldn't imagine that while she was clinging to hope, Ethan was clinging to an escape plan, one that would set them both on a collision course with tragedy. The night air carried a heavy chill as December settled over the small Indiana town. Holiday decorations hung from streetlights, glowing faintly against the dark. But the cheer of the season was absent from Breana's world. That evening, she slipped out of her house believing she was going to meet Ethan. He had finally agreed to talk, and she hoped this would be the moment when things turned around. She imagined he might soften, that he would listen, and that together they could figure out what came next. For a 17-year-old desperate for reassurance, that hope was enough to carry her into the night without hesitation. The meeting spot was quiet, chosen deliberately by Ethan so no one would see them. He had messaged her earlier with a sense of urgency, insisting they needed privacy. Breana, trusting the boy she cared for, didn't sense the danger lurking beneath his words. She thought he was finally ready to confront their situation, but his intentions were far darker. For weeks, he had been building toward this moment, convincing himself that the only way to free himself was to end everything in one decisive act. When Breana arrived, the atmosphere felt off. The silence was too deep, the shadows too long. She brushed away the unease, telling herself this was just a conversation. She pictured herself returning home later, relieved that they had finally made progress. Instead, she stepped into the trap that Ethan had carefully constructed. His fear had consumed him, leaving no space for compassion. What should have been a discussion about their unborn child turned into an eruption of violence. The attack was sudden and merciless. In that moment, Ethan's panic transformed into rage, and he lashed out with shocking brutality. Breana fought back as best she could, but she was caught off guard. Betrayed by someone she thought cared about her, the trust she carried into the night became her undoing. She struggled, confused and terrified, realizing too late that the boy she trusted had turned into her executioner. In those final moments, the life she had tried to protect, the child she hadn't even held yet, was taken with her. Ethan's actions silenced both mother and unborn baby in a single, unforgiving act. The cold ground became the place where her story ended, hidden away as though she were nothing more than a burden to be erased. He left her there, discarded, trying to cover the evidence of what he had done. But no matter how carefully he tried to conceal his crime, the truth had a way of breaking through. As the hours passed and Breana did not return home, her family began to worry. They expected to hear the door open, to hear her footsteps across the floor, but the silence grew unbearable. They reached out to friends, checked her usual spots, and eventually reported her missing. Panic spread quickly, for Breana was not the kind of girl to vanish without explanation. While the community began to mobilize, Ethan tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But every step he took, every word he spoke, carried the shadow of his crime. He had convinced himself that ending Breana's life would solve his problems. Yet all it did was entangle him in a deeper web of suspicion. The very secret he tried to bury had left traces behind. Messages, movements, and choices that would soon draw investigators closer to the truth. The night that began with Breana's hopeful walk into the dark ended with betrayal, violence, and silence. She had gone to meet someone she trusted, believing in love, and in the possibility of a future together. What she encountered instead was the cruelest deception, one that turned her dreams into tragedy and set off a search that would shake the entire town. When Breana failed to return home, worry quickly transformed into dread. At first, her family tried to remain calm, telling themselves that she might have stayed late with friends or lost track of time. But as the hours dragged on, the explanations became less believable. Her phone went silent, and calls went unanswered. By morning, panic had taken hold. Breana's disappearance was not like her. She was responsible, grounded, and rarely left without telling someone where she was going. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. News of her absence spread fast in the small town. Classmates whispered in hallways, parents checked in with one another, and social media posts flooded with her picture and pleas for information. Volunteers began to search the streets, fields, and wooded areas nearby. Neighbors opened garages and sheds hoping for a clue. The entire community united under the heavy weight of uncertainty, all asking the same haunting question. Where was Breana? Detectives were brought in quickly. They started by piecing together her last known movements. Friends explained that she had left the house late the night before. Some had seen her walking toward a meeting spot, though no one knew why. Investigators traced her phone records and discovered messages between her and Ethan. The exchanges painted a picture of a secret meeting arranged in the hours before she vanished. Suddenly, suspicion had a name. When detectives questioned Ethan, his story was shaky. He insisted they had met briefly, but claimed she left soon after, saying she was heading home. He spoke with a practiced calm, but the inconsistencies in his timeline raised red flags. The more they pressed, the more cracks appeared in his account. He seemed nervous, shifting in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Investigators noted his behavior, but needed evidence to back their instincts. The search for Breana intensified. Dogs were brought in, combing through patches of frozen ground and wooded trails. Helicopters scanned from above while volunteers covered every corner of the town. It was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a desperate hunt for truth. With each passing day, hope dwindled, yet determination grew stronger. Then, the first pieces of evidence began to surface. Items belonging to Breana were found discarded, a chilling sign that she had not left of her own free will. Detectives followed every lead, cross-checking Ethan's alibi, retracing his steps, and studying his communications. They discovered that his fear of being exposed had been weighing heavily on him. The messages between him and Breana revealed tension, arguments, and his reluctance to face the reality of her pregnancy. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Ethan's attempts to appear calm could not cover the truth hidden in his actions. He had been the last person to see her alive, and his story did not align with the growing mountain of evidence. The search now had a sharper focus, with detectives zeroing in on the boy who had once been considered her boyfriend. The community, though unaware of the details, began to suspect that something terrible had happened. The optimism that had fueled the early search efforts was giving way to grief and anger. Candlelight vigils were organized as families prayed for her safe return. But in the quiet conversations of neighbors, a darker thought settled. Perhaps Breana would never come home. Detectives pressed harder. They returned to Ethan, questioning him again and again. Each session revealed more contradictions. His words faltered under scrutiny, his carefully constructed facade beginning to collapse. What he didn't realize was that investigators already held pieces of the puzzle that pointed directly at him. All they needed now was the final, undeniable link between Breana's disappearance and his actions that night. The search for Breana was no longer just a community effort. It was becoming a race against time to prove the unthinkable. And in the background, beneath the cold December sky, the truth was waiting to be uncovered, hidden but never gone. The discovery of Breana's body confirmed the worst fears that had been circling the town. She had not simply run away, and she had not chosen to vanish. Her life had been stolen in a moment of violence that defied understanding. When investigators uncovered her remains, the atmosphere shifted from anxious hope to overwhelming grief. The entire community, which had once held onto the possibility of her safe return, was forced to confront the reality that she would never come home again. The news spread like wildfire, and the sense of loss was immediate and devastating. Detectives now had the grim confirmation they needed. The evidence pointed in one clear direction: Ethan. From the very beginning, he had been the common thread in Breana's final hours. His messages, his shifting story, and his strange behavior after her disappearance had all painted a picture of guilt. With the discovery of her body, there was no longer room for doubt. They confronted him with the evidence, laying out every inconsistency, every trace of proof that tied him to the crime. His denials grew weaker, his confidence faltered, and the truth began to emerge under the crushing weight of reality. The motive, once unclear, revealed itself in heartbreaking clarity. Breana had been murdered not for who she was, but for what she carried. Her pregnancy, the life growing inside her, was seen by Ethan as a trap he could not escape. Instead of accepting responsibility, he chose violence. The thought of becoming a father filled him with fear, and that fear twisted into an act of cruelty that left 2 lives extinguished. It was not only a crime against Breana, but against the child she never had the chance to meet. When the news broke, the town was consumed by shock and anger. How could someone so young commit such a brutal act? How could a girl full of promise, loved by so many, be taken in such a senseless way? Vigils were held in her memory, candles flickering against the cold night air as friends and family wept. Her classmates wrote messages, her coaches spoke of her spirit, and neighbors mourned the absence of a girl whose smile had once brightened their small town. The courtroom became the stage where the final pieces of the story unfolded. Ethan sat before the judge, no longer able to hide behind excuses or lies. The evidence was overwhelming. The messages, the inconsistencies, the discovery of her body. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a young man driven by fear and selfishness, willing to destroy a life to protect his own future. The defense offered explanations, but they could not erase the undeniable truth of what he had done. Breana's family filled the courtroom, their grief heavy and unshakable. They listened to every detail, forced to relive the horror of her final moments. No sentence could ever return their daughter to them. No punishment could restore what had been lost. But justice, however incomplete, offered some measure of accountability. Ethan was held responsible for his actions, his freedom stripped in recognition of the lives he had stolen. Even with justice served, the scars remained. The story of Breana's death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly fear can spiral into violence and how fragile life can be when trust is betrayed. For those who loved her, the pain of her absence was constant, a reminder of the future she would never have. For the community, her story was etched into memory, a tragedy that reshaped the town and left behind a legacy of sorrow. Breana Rouhselang's life was short, but her story lived on as a warning of what can happen when desperation turns deadly. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer with plans that were stolen before they could be realized. And though her voice was silenced, the impact of her loss echoed far beyond that December night.